Hello, historians. Welcome back to Cocktails and Cliff Notes. I'm your host, Mayson, and today I am going to need you to forget everything that you thought you knew about the American Revolution. We've been talking about the Revolution a lot. And we're going to go in a different direction today because while the history books celebrate the Patriots, obviously, there was a massive and often forgotten population of Americans who remained fiercely loyal to the British Crown. So, we're about to pour you a strong dose of reality as we explore the untold stories of those who sacrificed everything for their beliefs, even if it meant being on the quote unquote losing side of history. But before we jump into that, I'm going to pour us a drink. Super easy, super lazy. If you still want to skip that, use the timestamps below and be on the lookout for more content like this because I post every Tuesday and Thursday, and I love history and I love knowing things. And if you're like me, please join me for more. In the meantime, though, I'm going to pour our drink. Like I said, skip it. If not, stick with me. And then we're going to talk about the Loyalists during the American Revolution. So let's just dive right in. Now, I keep doing these lazy drinks because I'm feeling lazy. You guys, I don't know what it is. I just am feeling a little bit low energy, low budget, low effort, low rent, low. Lowly. I feel very lowly. So I am only being creative in the glasses in which I pour the drinks, not what I'm pouring into them right now. And I promise I will get it together. I promise we will go back to cocktails and smoothies and fun stuff and any kind of cool, fun drink. But as of right now, I just feel very tired. So I'm just going to pour myself a glass of champagne. But I did just get these really beautiful little coupe glasses that I want to use. And there's something about them that makes me feel so classy. Look how pretty. I just love it. It makes you feel very old timey, very classy, very elegant. And for some reason, I have it in my head that you can only drink pure champagne out of these. For some reason, I don't know, probably saw it in a movie, but I just think you have to only drink champagne. I almost made a mimosa in them the other day, and I was like, I can't be doing that. I just can't be doing that. It has to be pure champagne. And I swear, the minute you dump champagne into a glass like this, you go up like ten classy points, I think. You can kind of say whatever you want because as long as you have this in your hand, you're classy, I think. You know? Yeah, I don't know. So I somehow have that in my head. And, these were like $6 at Home Goods. And they've really elevated my cabinets. I don't know. Anyway, see, just talking. This is why I tell people I'm like, just skip. If you don't want to listen to me drudge and drone on about something that makes very little sense, then I would go ahead and skip ahead. But if not, thanks for sticking with me and cheers. Cheers to everything. Okay, now that we have our easy, classy drink, let's get into our story. Okay, I want you to imagine for a moment that it is the year 1776. Yes, yes, it's 1776. You have no heating and air conditioning. You have insane laws placed upon you. And if you want to learn about some of those, you might go watch the video I just posted because those were some mind blowing laws that were actually on the books. But it's 1776, and you cannot even laugh too hard at someone's joke or be up late without getting in some form of trouble. Now, at this time, the streets, they're buzzing with pamphlets, and all these pamphlets are calling for independence. Taverns roar with speeches about liberty and justice for all. The bells ring, muskets are cleaned. Everyone seems to know exactly where they stand, and that is everyone except for you. You're that one person that you know that has to keep rather quiet because you believe in the king. Not because you're blind, not because you're cowardly. It's more because of loyalty, order, the stability that the crown provided. And this mattered to you a lot more than the promise of an untested future. Now, that belief is not making you very popular. It actually makes you very dangerous at this time. The world is on fire. Now, the story that we're typically taught is very clean, it's very heroic, brave patriots versus a distant tyrant, freedom on this side, oppression on the other side. But real revolutions are never quite that tidy. They're not that clean, it's not that cut and dry. It's not just so straightforward that every single person agreed on every single point. We obviously see that today. There is no unified thought process. We have too many free thinking minds. And that was largely the same back then. There were too many free thinkers, and a lot of people disagreed. Now, I've said this before and I'll say it again. By the mid 1770s, the American colonies were a direct pressure cooker. Protest had escalated into violence, which was very scary and very serious. Words had turned into absolute weaponry. Neutrality was becoming largely impossible. You were being pressured to pick a side, and you were moreover being pressured to pick the patriotic freedom and independence for all side. And committees were demanding declarations, and silence was very, very suspicious. You couldn't even bite your tongue. You were very much expected to choose at this time, which I understand, and many people did. But the forgotten side, these were called loyalists, these were Tories, these were Kingsmen. People would call them Royal Americans. These were the same types of farmers, merchants, lawyers, enslaved peoples. They were seeking freedom. They were indigenous allies. They were recent immigrants. They were men of the clergy, and they were cautious neighbors who feared chaos more than they feared taxation. Some of these people were very, very wealthy, obviously, and they were tied to British trade. Others were very poor and wary of upheaval. Some of these people genuinely believed that Parliament could be reformed, and some saw rebellion as lawlessness. It was disguised as virtue. It was very treacherous, very treasonous, and people didn't like it. And what united them was not ideology, it was actually just an overwhelming sense of doubt, which is super understandable. You know the old saying about how, what is it? Oh, people will choose a familiar hell over an unfamiliar heaven. That's very true in all walks of life. Like very true. I mean, I think we all probably know somebody who's choosing the same old over and over because it's very familiar, it's very comfortable. I get it. Familiar hell, it's safer that way. And that's largely what was going on with these people. There was so much doubt. There was doubt that independence would bring stability. There was doubt that revolutionary leaders spoke for every single person. There was doubt that tearing down a system guaranteed something better. These people were not villains. They were not heroes. They were questioning humans who were trying to think through things very carefully before they, you know, hitched their cart to any particular horse. I get it. Now, I will say that history often flattens these loyalists into these ridiculous caricatures, into traitors, cowards, enemies of freedom, which is just not true. There's no such thing as a one size fits all. Their choices were often rather agonizing. Supporting the crown could actually cost you your neighbors, your property, your safety. Supporting the revolution could mean betraying your lifelong beliefs or risking everything on an uncertain gamble that was going to take a Herculean effort to accomplish and achieve. And so it was very, very wise, if you actually ask me, to question or at least very carefully think through some of the ideals that were being thrown at people. And that's what these people were doing. They were cautious, ever so cautious. And there was really no safe side in these people's minds. And that's where the real intrigue lives, because revolutions aren't just fought by those who shout the loudest. This we know. They're shaped by the people who actually hesitate, who resist, who choose continuity over change, and who pay the price when the world decides without them. So tonight we're just stepping into their shoes. That's all I want. I just want us to take a look at things from a different point of view, because I love this point in history. It's amazing. Some of the things that were done, the speeches, the triumph, it's amazing. But there was a different side to this coin. This is not necessarily to excuse or even to condemn. This is just to understand better, which is my favorite thing in the world. And tonight, I really want us to understand the Americans who stood apart when everybody else was choosing sides and knew exactly where they wanted to be. These are people who were a little bit unsure because sometimes the most revealing stories are the ones that history actually pushes to the side. Those are my favorite. I love learning about those. I love a little bit of new information, especially regarding stories we've heard 1,000 times. Now, let's just peel back some of the ideology. Let's look at the ledger and the sermon and the map because loyalty for many, many people was not an emotional thing. It was very practical. It made a lot of sense. And again, I get it. Believe me, I get it. There are some things I'm very impulsive over, and then there are some things that I will drive myself nuts over. And this was a very big decision to make. There were large economic entanglements. Should I say large? There were extreme. There was the very real facet of economic entanglements. So, for merchants and different landowners, the British Empire was not an abstract authority. It was actually a very good business partner to have. Okay, great. So there were British ports, and these were absolutely thriving under imperial trade networks. British credit was underwriting shipping ventures, which was great. British buyers were purchasing tobacco, they were purchasing rice, they were purchasing furs, anything from the 1770s, you name it. And their insurance, British insurance, was actually absorbing a lot of the risk, which is great. A rupture with the crown would threaten literally all of this, and not just profit, but it might actually threaten survival itself, which is a big no-no. That's something that has to be thought through. Then there were land grants that tied families directly to royal favor. Titles, claims, and charters flowed straight out of London. Independence didn't just promise freedom, it actually threatened to reopen ownership itself. So to these loyalists, rebellion looked less like liberation and more like economic self sabotage. It was very understandable that they did not want to participate in something that did not play a role in their personal investments. Really, why gamble everything on an untested system when the current one, however imperfect, still paid dividends? I mean, that's an understandable thing. It's like, it's kind of not perfect, but it's not necessarily broke. So, do we really need to fix it? That was just kind of the whole theme, the whole idea that was running through people's heads. And then on top of all of this, because I understand the business deals and stuff like that, you got to get your ducks in a row before you decide that you're just going to say F you to the crown. But for others, loyalty ran a lot deeper than just money. There were a lot of colonists who genuinely believed in legitimate authority, in structure. They had grown up with a monarchy as a stabilizing force. They were used to it. It was reinforced by scripture and tradition and just bad habits, or good habits, depending on where you stand. Kings ruled by divine sanction. This wasn't necessarily that they were good at politicking, it wasn't personal charm. Order actually flowed downward. Society was held together because someone sat at the top. The idea of republicanism actually frightened people. And again, I feel like I always have to clarify this. When I say republicanism, I'm not necessarily saying Republican Party. I am saying the republic in which we stand. The whole one nation under God stuff, the republic in which we stand, not right leaning Republican. Let's just get that straight. That's not what I mean. Anyway, a government that's run by committees and popular opinion sounded actually a lot less like freedom to these particular people and more like mob rule. Group mentality sounded a little chaotic, a little scary because without a king who enforced restraint, who prevented ambition from just spiraling into chaos. I mean, really, like, how could you prevent that from happening if you didn't have a structured set of doing things, a structured way of proceeding with daily life, really? So, to these loyalists, freedom, revolution, it didn't actually sound like progress. It actually felt more like regression. It was anarchy. It was anarchy wearing a very noble language, and that scared them a lot. Which, again, I mean, I just understand it. This is why I like to look into this side of things because I'm like, I get where you're coming from. I understand that line of thought because when we learn about it, especially as Americans, we think, God, that was so badass. How cool for them. Thank God they did that. But at the time, I mean, it actually makes sense to really think through all of these separate points, doesn't it? I think it does, right? What do you think? I don't know. Maybe I'm crazy. Now, on top of all of this, geography actually sharpened these fears just a little bit because in border regions and frontier settlements, British authority offered a great deal of protection. There were garrisons, these discouraged attacks. Treaties with indigenous nations, however flawed, however dishonest and sneaky they were, they actually provided a framework that made people feel somewhat safe at the time about coexistence. There were imperial officials, and however distant they might be, they represented some form of continuity. And revolution was threatening to dissolve these very, very fragile arrangements that they were fragile on their own. And if we add this whole revolution thing to it, my God, it might just spin out into a very chaotic world. And we can't have that. We've got business to attend. I'm very scared. I get that. I totally get that. So, for these particular settlers who were living on contested land, the British military, it was not considered oppressive at all. It was actually a buffer against unnecessary violence. It was a buffer against retaliation and uncertainty. And for enslaved people who were promised freedom by the crown, loyalty became a very calculated bid for survival. So the revolution was not necessarily offering safety to everyone equally. And the Loyalists knew it. So, taken together, these motivations actually form a very consistent pattern, don't you think? Loyalists were not necessarily clinging blindly to the past. Many were very carefully assessing the risk involved. They were weighing the stability against upheaval. They were choosing the devil they know over the future no one could clearly see or even describe. And history often rewards the winners with moral clarity. But in the moment, loyalists to the crown were not necessarily cowardice. It was a decision rooted in economics, in faith, in fear of collapse. It was very understandable. And understanding that doesn't actually dilute the revolution at all, if you ask me. It actually deepens it greatly. And there's a piece of it that kind of adds a more three-dimensional uh empathy that I at least feel with it because it wasn't just a one size fits all. I know I keep saying that. That's become my favorite thing to say lately, but I don't think there are one size fits alls for really any scenario ever on the earth ever. Prove me wrong. I would love for you to prove me wrong, but I don't think that there's a through line that every single person on earth would say, at least not very many. And during this time, I think it's very interesting to look at the other side. I really do, just because it wasn't like every single person was just exactly perfectly on the same page. And for good reason. If you're actually going to put together a movement that is strong enough to reshape history, it didn't just have to overcome the empire itself, it was going to have to help shift or put at ease some of the very real and reasonable doubts of the people who actually were living in the eye of the storm. That's understandable. Yes, I think so. I think so. Maybe I'm stupid. I don't know. But this is where the story actually tightens, and we're going to turn it just a bit more personal. There are no banners, there are no abstractions, just direct consequences. Because other than having these little thoughts in your head, there were other things and very real, I don't want to say consequences, but repercussions for every move made in the colonies at this time. Now, one thing that I love saying is that the revolution did not just divide the colonies, it split kitchens. Or I like to say stuff like, oh, revolution wasn't just built in Congress, it was built in the drawing room, or something like that, something very fun and cool and makes me sound like I'm smarter than I am. But anyway, that's what I'm getting at, is that this revolution didn't just divide colonies, it split kitchens. generations, brothers stopped speaking to each other. Parents were disowning their children. There were marriages that were strained under questions no one could answer without choosing an actual side to stand on. So loyalty, it was becoming this thing that was no longer theoretical. It was interrogated at the dinner table. People were getting into fights in the town square. A son who would join the militia, a father refused to announce the crown, a wife tried to keep peace and she failed miserably. I mean, families were splitting up. This was breaking people apart. Social groups, of course, but the family unit itself, because you got that rebellious teenager that's like, I want to stay loyal to the crown. And dad's like, mm-mm. Mm-mm, mm-mm, we're patriots. Now they don't speak. That sucks. That's very real. These are real people, like real human beings that had to live through this. And if you didn't happen to think like the people around you that you love, it could rip you apart. That's very sad. I don't want that to be a reality today. Please don't let that be a reality today. Oh, please don't. And even though we did not have Instagram and Facebook back then, these were very small towns. And in a small town, every single person knows. Neutrality was read as deception, or you were just deemed somebody who agreed with the other side and you just didn't want to fight about it. Silence was very suspicious, you guys. It was not cool. Loyalists were finding themselves uninvited, they were whispered about, they were excluded from even church and marketplaces. Social life was just this really confusing little web. Once cut, it was so difficult to repair, and isolation was becoming the punishment long before any law intervened. It was like you would get ostracized for this kind of stuff. So, as the war escalated, the consequences for differing from the public group decision, the consequences, they just got greater and greater, more intense, more steep, you guys. Sheesh. Now, again, when I am saying consequences, I just don't even feel like that is the appropriate word to use. Because for me, the word consequences makes it sound like you didn't do your homework and now you're grounded. Like that's a consequence for your action. In a nation that was founded upon freedom of belief and freedom of thought and speech, etc., which again, this is before all of those things were actually written in ink. But the reason that we came over to America in the first place was because we were tired of being told what we could and couldn't do. So when you get over here, and just because the public opinion is shifting in one direction doesn't mean that you do not have the right to think differently. That's the whole point. That's why we ended up at Plymouth. So I don't like the word consequences, but let's just roll with it for a second, because let's say repercussions. You're one of those people, you're a little bit apprehensive. Maybe you're not even speaking out, but you're being very, very tight lipped around your very patriotic friends. And so what ends up happening is the patriots are actually forming committees and they're putting these lists together. And so as a result, your name's on the list and now your home gets searched. Your property might even get seized. I'm not kidding you. There were a lot of loyalists who were even forced to swear oaths or face fines. They faced imprisonment, they faced exile, all of these things very, very equally dangerous. Your refusal actually marked you as an enemy living among neighbors. The harassment was going to be nonstop. You were going to have people who were going to be throwing stuff in your windows in the middle of the night. I am not kidding you. Your livestock might disappear. There were threats, very scary and very real threats that arrived in either an anonymous note or they were shouted at you. They were very scary. Think about it. You've got a family, you've got kids you have to look out for, and you're being shouted at that you're a traitor or something. That's very scary. That's a threat to your direct household, which is terrifying to most humans, especially back then when survival was so difficult already. There were some loyalists, I am not kidding you, who were tarred and feathered, which was a very well known ritual designed less to injure people, more so it was geared towards humiliation, and you were immediately turned into a warning in the act of being tarred and feathered, which is crazy. Absolutely crazy. That is a weird thing to do. I wonder who came up with that. Who was the first person that was like, let's tar and feather this guy? All of these things, awful, of course, but there were some people who were actually not even as lucky as getting a little bit of tar and feather on them. There were people who were actually beaten. There were people whose houses were burnt. People would just go missing. They vanished. So, in a war fueled by ideology, restraint was eroding very, very quickly. Zealotry actually replaced debate. The revolution promised liberty, but it enforced conformity, which didn't make a lot of sense. It was just a little bit contradictory, slightly paradoxical, just a little bit weird. Kind of one of those where you're like, my God, it's funny how you don't see that you're being a little bit hypocritical. For the Loyalists, there was a very unsteady rhythm that was going on. Safety very much rose and it fell with troop movements, and basically whoever had won the last battle. So when British forces were actually occupying a certain area, loyalists would emerge very cautiously, kind of like a little deer walking up to grab a little drink of water. So it was very cautious, very scary for them. Businesses of these loyalist men or women, men, because it was 1776. I'm not the one that did that. I'm just pointing out that it was probably businesses of the men. They reopened. There were flags that were changed. Old confidence flickered back to life. Some believed the tide had turned for the good. Then the army would move out of that area. The British army, the British military. The British military would exit that area for whatever reason. And it was like, everything went away. The Patriot forces would return, retribution followed, past loyalties were very much remembered, lists were resurfacing, and protection was gone. Vanished overnight. You were back in the thick of it. So every shift in control forced a recalculation and kind of a recalibrating of who was doing what in that area at that time. Now, at this point, do you stay? Do you flee? Do you hide? Do you declare? Trust? Survive? I mean, what are you going to do? I mean, this is some real stuff. You're kind of playing with your life. And if you're a family fella or a, loving wife and mother, you have other little ones to think about. Every single thing that you do is like, do I abandon my own belief system for the safety and protection of my kids? Or do I stand up for what I believe in and put my whole family in jeopardy? Think about the reality of that for just a second. That's not an easy question to answer. It's really not. I think it's easy to stand up for your beliefs when it's just you against the world. When you have people that you truly love, especially your children, you have to think these things through. You really do. And what's the example that I want to set for my kids? If I conform just because I want to keep them safe, am I also setting an example that beliefs don't mean anything? I mean, these are things that people are having to think through and reason through in their own minds. These are not easy questions, you guys. This is not something that you can just decide on a whim. This is very real. Now, there were some people who were kind of chasing safety. In a sense, these loyalists, they were moving around quite a bit. They were chasing the temporary security across these shifting lines. Others just stayed put. They endured quietly. They were kind of hoping that the storm would just pass. And honestly, it didn't matter what you chose to do regarding those two options, which was like, you know, chase your own protection or stay put and hope that it all just gets straightened out. It didn't matter. There were a lot of people who just guessed wrong. They did the wrong thing, ended up wrong place, wrong time, wrong belief system. You're out of here, buddy. And not in a fun way. Like, you're out of here, buddy. You're in some trouble. Now, the hardest part of all of this by far was uncertainty. There was no clear timeline. You never knew when this was going to end. There was no promise of amnesty. There was no assurance that loyalty would be rewarded or forgiven if the British did succeed. Loyalist lives were suspended between outcomes that they had very, very little, if any, control over. These were not the types of people who were out there actually fighting on the battlefield. They were not soldiers. They were everyday men loyal to the crown. These little civilians, they were stuck inside history's little tug of war, this little argument that was going back and forth, and they're just kind of going with whatever is happening at the time. Terrifying. Again, if you got kids, that just opens up a whole other world of being scared, I would think. Now, let's talk about when the war finally ended and victory was bringing peace for a lot of people and excitement, and we're a new nation under God, but for loyalists, For some people, it actually was not a very peaceful time. It was not awesome. They were on the losing side, technically. So that's kind of scary. Now, for these people, this could bring exile, confiscation, and it really brought the realization that the country that they helped to build, just as much as any other colonists leading up to this point, it no longer wanted them. They were not welcome in a place that they put their lives into for years and years prior to this massive kerfuffle. The revolution, while it on the one hand created a nation, it was actually sorting people out. And for those who actually did choose the crown, the cost was often paid not in ideals, but in homes, families, and the quiet understanding that history would not be kind to their side of the story. And again, you can see both sides. Now, this is kind of the ripple effect of the revolution, the shadow side, the part that happens after the treaties are signed and all the cheering and the excitement and the popping champagne because we won, guys. Once all of that kind of fades away, this is where, when the war ended, home and life as we know it also ended too. Peace did not necessarily mean reconciliation. So, for tens of thousands of loyalists, the end of the war was a single devastating truth. The truth that these particular loyalists were looking directly in the face, in the mouth, in the eyes, in the mirror, was that there was no place for them in this brand new nation, the United States. They just didn't feel at home in their home any longer after the war was done, or I guess probably leading up to and during the war as well. They just didn't feel comfortable here. Now, this is where some estimates vary, but somewhere between about 60,000 and 80,000 loyalists, they left their former colonies in the years during or immediately after the war. Some departed with the British troops. There were others who left very quietly, and they did it a couple years later when it became very clear that forgiveness was just not going to come. And again, I don't even like the word forgiveness. When letting bygones be bygones was not going to happen, that's when these people very quietly made their way to Canada, or they made their way across the Atlantic back to Britain, or they went south to the Caribbean, actually, very specifically the Bahamas and Jamaica. So honestly, let me just tell you right here, right now, if I would have been back then, either side, I don't care, but I would have gone to the Bahamas in a heartbeat. What if you're like, oh my God, that country's crazy, let's go to Exuma? I would love that. Oh my God. Oops, I'm forced to go to the Bahamas. It's a little hectic up there. I'm going to the beach. Oh my God, why didn't everybody do that? That would have been my move. I would have gone there. Ooh, I would have gone there so fast. Why didn't every person do that? I would have done that in a heartbeat. I want to do it right now. That would be awesome. Anyway, these particular people who took their petticoats down to the Bahamas, or their bloomers, what were they wearing? Pantaloons. They got their little pantaloons down to the Bahamas, or wherever they went. They weren't necessarily leaving in good standing. They were not leaving as conquerors. They were not leaving as diplomats. They were basically, in a nutshell, refugees. There were a lot of families who boarded many different ships with basically what they could carry. Their homes were abandoned. They just left every single thing that they built in an instant. I mean, they had to say sayonara. I mean, they had their stuff confiscated. If they had anything left, they had to leave it. Their things were redistributed. Entire lives were very much compressed into a trunk or one of those little old-timey suitcases that they used to use that I thought were really cool. And they basically just had their memories, and they said, we got to go to the Bahamas. I'm sad. I got to go to the Bahamas. I don't think the Bahamas was like it is now, though. It wasn't like they were going to live at a resort in the Bahamas and sit on the beach in a bikini. They were going to make a new life somewhere with hot temperatures in a 30-layer suit and dress. So I'm being ridiculous. I understand it wasn't a good thing, but I gotta go to the Bahamas. I'm so sad. I'm so sad. What a bummer. Oh, I'm kidding. I'm totally kidding. I promise you. I'm sorry. This is not funny. because the revolution had very much drawn its borders. Starting over was very dangerous. It was very unforgiving, and exile was not offering any forms of comfort. This was an awful thing. If you went to Canada, which I can't fathom why any person would go to Canada when you could have not done that. And I'm not saying that like, oh God, Canada. I'm saying that like it's cold. That's the only reason I would say that. I have no hatred for Canada. That's not how I meant that. Let's just get that straight right here, right now. But if you did go to Canada at this time, it was basically just a patchwork of frontier settlements. It had land that you could definitely get your hands on, but that was pretty much it. And let's also just not forget that that land was covered in snow a lot of the year. It was very harsh up there. The temperatures, the predators, infrastructure, very sparse. Supplies were very unreliable. Loyalists were hacking farms from forests, and they basically just went up there and they built these little towns out of scratch in the freezing cold. So again, why didn't anybody do that? I am a hot weather person. I am a hot weather gal. I do not know why anybody would go to Canada solely based on weather. But some of these people did, and some of them failed, and others actually endured, as pretty much any place anyone's ever gone. Some people fail miserably, others endure. Now, former elites, they found themselves laboring alongside the poor, which was very, very humbling for a lot of people. You know, you used to be this high up businessman, and then the war comes through, and all of your British connections are gone. Nobody likes you, and now you got to make your way, and you have to completely start over. Your title meant nothing. Compensation from Britain arrived very slowly, if it even arrived at all. You do not want to hang your hat on that promise. Pride just had to be swallowed. You were just going to have to get over it. Skills had to be relearned. Communities leaned on one another with fierce, scared intensity. I don't even know where I was going with that sentence, but I'm just saying like the people to the left and right of you were what got you through this. There was literally no alternative. Now, if for the people who did go to the Caribbean, you know, the ones with very good heads on their shoulders who make good decisions and make good choices for themselves and their family, these loyalists, they actually survived and rebuilt lives through trade, plantations, commerce, and they carried a little bit of that moral contradiction of the empire with them because in Britain, many discovered that loyalty did not guarantee belonging. They were somewhat colonials there too, and yet they just continued to persist. They built schools, courts, churches, newspapers, anything you can think of. They organized towns that still carry some very heavy loyalist roots. They adapted, and not because they were rewarded, but it was basically just a matter of survival. It was because survival demanded it. The loyalist exodus actually reshaped a lot of North America because up in Canada, where they're freezing their little booties off, their presence actually strengthened ties to the crown, which deepened a lot of suspicion of revolutionary radicalism. The loyalist experience was actually helping to define a political culture that prioritized stability, it prioritized gradual reform. And one of the main things was it really prioritized order over upheaval, which is not the worst thing. Now, Canada did not become America in part, only partially, because it had actually watched what the revolution had done to families and people on an individual level, on a very personal level, and they didn't like it. And so that just kind of made them very careful. They were like, we're willing to play ball with this great empire. We're going to play ball with you. We don't want that here. And again, very understandable. Now, back in the United States, the departure of all of these loyalist families actually changed everything, but it did it very quietly. There was a lot of land that was redistributed. There was a lot of power consolidation. Opposition very much diminished, or people were just silent about it. Like, just don't say a word. Don't even bring it up. type of stuff. There was a new nation that formed with fewer voices that were arguing for restraint or reconciliation with the old system. There were not a lot of people that were taking the time to advocate for the old way of doing things. And history a lot of times frames this as inevitable, but it wasn't. It really was not. It was a result of choices, pressure, and the unwillingness to fully make room for dissent. So, what remains, the Loyalists did not lose necessarily because they were wrong. They lost because revolution, by their nature, cannot tolerate divided allegiance for an extended period of time. Now, this particular framing on things, just taking a look at the other side, is meant to remind us that every founding creates exiles, every victory redraws belongings, every new nation leaves some of its people standing on the wrong side of the future. They helped build the world that eventually turned around and rejected them. And then, with remarkable resilience, they packed up their stuff, what little they could, and they went to a new place and they helped to build another. That is the resilience of the human spirit. And that is one thing that I love about the human animal. And even though it's hard and it's difficult and it's largely unfair in a lot of ways, and I hate barking the unfair horn or bark, I, it's not fair. They gave everything for one place. They disagreed just a little bit and they said, okay, now we're going to go do it again somewhere else. That too is a part of the American Revolution. Even if it unfolded somewhere else, even if these people did have to relocate, the American Revolution is often told in these very bold colors. It gets you all jacked up and excited about the fact that we came together as a new nation. There are heroes on one side, there are villains on the other, and it makes for very clean storytelling and very comforting certainty. But that's not the whole thing. That's not how you can always look at history. There are always good and bad people on both sides. Real history lives in the gray area. Loyalists were not simply wrong, patriots were not simply right. They were people that were making decisions inside uncertainty, inside fear, hope, faith, and a lot of self interest, of course. And this is exactly what we're still doing to this day. Some choose liberty at all costs, some choose stability at all risks, and most are just trying to protect their families, their livelihoods, their futures, even though you just can't see it clearly. So when we flatten these choices, we lose something very, very vital. In my opinion, we lose the reminder that revolutions and nations are not born because everybody's on the same page at all times. They're born from disagreement, tensions, and compromise, and a lot of people are often left very unhappy. Things never get fully resolved, and that's understandable because you can't make every single person happy. We just try to do the best that we can and try to get as many people as we can feeling appeased, but you will never, I don't think, possibly, maybe I'm wrong. I would love to be wrong, but I just cannot fathom that there has ever been any point in history when every single person has been entirely pleased with anything at all times. There's no way that all of these free thinking and feeling human individuals could all fully feel appeased at all times. So, I mean, why does any of this even still matter? I just feel like the loyalist story is still echoing today because I do feel like we're still arguing over authority and reform. We still fear chaos and overreach. We still struggle to define who belongs where when visions of the future clash or when perceptions of our current reality differ so greatly. So, understanding loyalists hopefully doesn't weaken the story of the American Revolution. It should strengthen our understanding of it. It should make it a lot more real and relatable because empathy doesn't erase ideals, it actually humanizes them. It makes them so personal. And if we can acknowledge that intelligent, principled people once stood on opposite sides of American founding, maybe it would help to lower the temperature just a little bit on our own disagreements. We have never been a species, us cool ass humans, we have never been a species that has not had drastically differing opinions. And we're not unique in our current time period now. I think we are because we all have cell phones. And I know exactly what that person who I've never met in Florida is thinking because they posted about it. But this is not unique. This has been going on for at least since the birth of this country. Now, history, I don't think, is asking us to choose sides again. I just think the request made would be that we listen better. And I think that when you know the past, you can do better in the future. It's like a hindsight thing, but you didn't have to live through the revolution unless you believe in reincarnation and you think you did, but you can't really remember in this lifetime. I don't know, but you didn't have to live through that. So you can learn from people without having to live the exact same scenarios and mistakes. Now, here is the distilled takeaway, if I do say so myself. Revolutions, they're messy, you guys, obviously. Motives are always mixed, and certainty is rare at any moment throughout the entirety of conscious human recorded history. Nobody has ever truly known what the hell they're doing. We're all just doing our damn best and we're screwing up pretty bad. And we were getting some stuff right too. I don't want to go too negative with it. I just want this little story of the Loyalists to just very much remind us that history is not always a victory lap. It's a conversation that should be carried forward, shaped, and expanded upon by those that remember and are remembered and those that were forgotten. So tonight, let's just raise a glass to the Americans who did not win and didn't stay and didn't get any statues or awesome movies made about them. These are to the families that were divided, to the exiles who had to pack up their stuff and rebuild and go somewhere else and then rebuild again. And I mean, my God, this is to the stories that are actually very complicating to our own personal comfort. This is to the Loyalists. I mean, really, this is to the contrast in this particular point in history. So, if this episode at all made you rethink what you thought you knew, explore deeper, read about this, question everything, always. And most of all, stick around because there are many more untold stories that I have locked and loaded, and history gets a lot more interesting when we stop pretending that it was simple and it was just as I've said many times this episode and in my personal life recently, when we pretend that it was a one size fits all. There are never, ever any wars that were fought where there are all good guys and there are all bad guys. That is not the case. That will never be the case ever. There are good people everywhere, and there are some heinous little assholes also be bopping around in the world. So let's just do a quick cheers to the past in all of its inconvenient complexity. And I will see you in the next one.